I never thought I'd be the one to silence a room full of judgmental in-laws on Christmas Day. But there's something about watching people's faces fall when they realize you hold their financial future in your hands. 5 years of condescension, whispers, and accidental exclusions had led to this moment. Me, standing at their perfectly decorated dining table, mortgage papers in hand, while they stared at the plastic fork they'd given me instead of the heirloom silverware everyone else was using. The plastic cutlery wasn't what broke me. It was the final straw in a long campaign to remind me I didn't belong in their precious Connecticut family. What they didn't know as they passed around their golden brown turkey and vintage wine, while handing me boxed mashed potatoes and tap water, was that I'd secretly purchased their underwater mortgage 6 months earlier, when their bank was ready to foreclose on their cherished family estate. The home they'd spent the entire dinner reminding me I wasn't good enough to be in was actually mine, and I was about to unwrap that little Christmas surprise right between the main course and dessert. When I first met David, it was at a fundraiser in Boston where I was working as an event coordinator. He was everything his family valued. Harvard-educated, from a respectable New England lineage dating back to the Mayflower, and employed at a prestigious law firm. I was a scholarship kid from rural Pennsylvania who'd worked 3 jobs to put myself through a state college. According to the Caldwell family rulebook, I might as well have been from another planet. Margaret Caldwell, David's mother, is what people politely call old money particular. Behind closed doors, she's a master of the subtle dig, the backhanded compliment, and the strategic exclusion. She runs their sprawling colonial home in Greenwich with military precision, and the annual Christmas gathering is her command performance. When I first met David, it was at a fundraiser in Boston where I was working as an event coordinator. He was everything his family valued. Harvard-educated, from a respectable New England lineage dating back to the Mayflower, and employed at a prestigious law firm. I was a scholarship kid from rural Pennsylvania who'd worked 3 jobs to put myself through a state college. According to the Caldwell family rulebook, I might as well have been from another planet. Margaret Caldwell, David's mother, is what people politely call old money particular. Behind closed doors, she's a master of the subtle dig, the backhanded compliment, and the strategic exclusion. She runs their sprawling colonial home in Greenwich with military precision, and the annual Christmas gathering is her command performance. Her husband, Richard, mostly nods along, occasionally emerging from his study to refill his scotch and make uncomfortable comments about the way America used to be. The rest of the clan follows her lead. David's sisters, Elizabeth and Catherine, with their equally pedigreed husbands, their children dressed like miniature country club members even on Christmas morning, and a revolving cast of aunts and uncles who all seem to have the same passive-aggressive communication style genetically encoded. I still remember my first Thanksgiving with them, 3 months after David and I started dating. I'd brought my grandmother's sweet potato casserole, a recipe that had won county fair ribbons back home. Margaret took one look at it and said, "Oh, how rustic. We'll put it on the side table with the children's dishes." Later that evening, I overheard her telling Elizabeth, "She's trying, bless her heart, but you can't expect someone from her background to understand our traditions." Then there was the forgotten invitation to David's birthday celebration. We'd been dating for over a year, and I only found out about the party when David called me from the restaurant, wondering where I was. Margaret had sent invitations to everyone except me, claiming it must have been lost in the mail. David confronted her, but she tearfully insisted it was an innocent mistake, and somehow I ended up being the villain for making her cry. The most humiliating incident came at our engagement dinner.
Margaret had arranged for a photographer to document the evening, and when the family portraits were being taken, she physically maneuvered me to the edge of every group shot. When the photos were printed and framed throughout their home, I noticed I'd been cropped out of most of them. When David pointed this out, Margaret simply said, "Well, dear, we wanted to focus on family." Despite all this, David was the light that made dealing with them worthwhile. He was kind, loving, and stood up for me, though never quite forcefully enough to actually change anything. His grand gesture came after we married, when he insisted we move closer to his family to heal the rift. He genuinely believed that with enough time, they would see what he saw in me. What none of them knew, not even David, was that I had a particular skill set from my unrefined upbringing. My father had been a small-town real estate investor who taught me everything about property values, mortgages, and market forecasting before alcoholism took him away. This knowledge became my secret weapon when I discovered, through a college friend now working in banking, that the Caldwell family estate was in serious financial trouble. Richard's investments had collapsed, and they were 6 months behind on their mortgage payments. Last Christmas Eve started like any other at the Caldwell estate, with Margaret micromanaging everything, from the placement of poinsettias to the precise angle of the nativity scene figurines. David and I arrived early at Margaret's insistence. "Someone needs to help with the place settings," she'd told him over the phone, though when we arrived, she quickly shooed me away from the dining room. "Melissa, dear, perhaps you could help in the kitchen instead. The good china is quite valuable." Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she redirected me to the kitchen, where the housekeeper was already handling everything efficiently. I spent the morning trying to make myself useful while watching Margaret delegate the important tasks to her daughters. Elizabeth was in charge of arranging the family's ancestral silverware, pieces that supposedly came over on the Mayflower, though I'd once made the mistake of pointing out that the pattern was clearly Victorian. Catherine was responsible for the wine selection, an honor Margaret reminded everyone requires a certain palate. By afternoon, guests began arriving: Richard's business associates, distant cousins who summered in the Hamptons, and a state senator Margaret had strategically seated next to David. "He could be wonderful for your career advancement," she whispered loud enough for me to hear. "Much more beneficial than pro bono work." David squeezed my hand under the table. He knew I was proud of his decision to take on cases for immigrants and low-income families, even if his mother saw it as charity work rather than a real career. As dinner approached, I noticed Margaret whispering to Elizabeth while looking in my direction. When it came time to be seated, I found myself at the far end of the table, wedged between David's teenage nephew, who was glued to his phone, and Richard's hard-of-hearing uncle, who kept calling me Michelle. Then came the moment that would change everything. The housekeeper began serving the first course, a butternut squash soup that Margaret claimed was an old family recipe, though I'd seen the gourmet delivery truck earlier. As fine china bowls were placed before each guest, I watched in disbelief as the housekeeper set a paper bowl in front of me. I looked up, catching Margaret's eye. She gave a little shrug. "We're a bit short on china this year, I'm sure you understand." When the main course arrived, everyone received gleaming plates and the sterling silver that had been lovingly arranged earlier. I got a festive paper plate with Santa's face on it and plastic cutlery still in its wrapper. A hush fell over the nearby seats as people noticed, followed by uncomfortable throat clearing. David was deep in conversation with the senator and hadn't noticed yet. Catherine's husband stifled a laugh. Elizabeth at least had the decency to look embarrassed. "Is there a problem?" Margaret asked innocently when she saw me staring at my place setting. "No," I replied, unwrapping my plastic fork with deliberate care. "No problem at all." The tension was palpable as I struggled to cut through the prime rib with my flimsy plastic knife. It snapped in half with my third attempt, sending a piece flying onto the imported tablecloth. "Oh dear," Margaret sighed. "Perhaps we should have served you the children's chicken tenders. They're easier to manage with simpler utensils." That's when David finally noticed. "Mom, what is this? Why doesn't Melissa have proper dinnerware?" "We're just short this year, darling. It's not a big deal." Margaret's voice was honey-sweet. "Then why does everyone else have the good china?" David pressed. "Well," Margaret said, dabbing her lips with her linen napkin, "family heirlooms should be used by family, don't you think?" The table fell silent. 5 years of marriage, and Margaret had just publicly declared I wasn't family. David's face flushed red. "Melissa is my wife. She is family." Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. Now, let's not make a scene at Christmas dinner. Melissa doesn't mind, do you, dear?" All eyes turned to me. I felt something shift inside, a dam breaking after years of taking the high road. "Actually," I said, reaching for my purse, "I think this is the perfect time to share some news with the family." I could feel my heart hammering as I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. The room seemed to slow down. Margaret's narrowed eyes, David's confused expression, the uncomfortable shifting of relatives suddenly very interested in their prime rib. "What are you doing, Melissa?" David whispered, but I was already standing.
"You know," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "For 5 years, I've tried to be part of this family. I've smiled through the insults, accepted the accidental exclusions, and pretended not to notice when you all mock my background." I looked directly at Margaret. "I've watched you crop me out of photos, seat me at children's tables, and today serve me dinner on paper plates with plastic cutlery that can't even cut the food you've provided." Margaret's face reddened. "I think you're being overly sensitive." "I'm not finished," I said, surprising even myself with my firmness. "David believes I should keep trying to win your approval, but I finally realized something important. I don't need it. In fact, after today, you might be the ones needing something from me." I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of official-looking documents. 6 months ago, I learned through an old college friend at Connecticut First Bank that this house, this precious family estate you lord over everyone, was in foreclosure. "Your investments tanked, didn't they, Richard?" Richard choked on his wine. "That's private family business. My family business now, actually," I corrected him, laying the papers on the table. "You see, I took the money I inherited when my unsophisticated father died and formed an LLC. Then I bought your mortgage from the bank when they were looking to offload bad debt." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the teenage nephew had put down his phone. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered, but her face had gone pale. "Is it? Didn't your father teach you about real estate too, Richard? Mine did. Between shifts at the factory, he invested in foreclosures and taught me everything he knew. The skills you mock as common are exactly what allowed me to purchase the debt on this house for 30 cents on the dollar." David stared at the papers, then at me. "You never told me." "Just like you never told me your family was underwater on their mortgage," I replied quietly. "We all have our secrets." I turned back to the table. "So here's where we stand. I now hold the note on this property. I could foreclose immediately, or I could offer new terms." I looked directly at Margaret. "Perhaps we could discuss it over dessert? I assume you have paper plates for that, too." Elizabeth's husband let out a low whistle. Catherine's perfect posture had collapsed into a slump. The senator was suddenly very interested in his water glass. Margaret stood up shakily.
This is preposterous. Richard, tell her this is nonsense. But Richard couldn't meet her eyes. Maggie, I think we should talk in private. No more private conversations, I said firmly. No more secrets and whispers. 5 years of being treated like an outsider ends tonight. I gathered the papers back into the envelope. David, I'll be waiting in the car when you're ready to leave. As for the rest of you, Merry Christmas. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the mortgage after the holidays. As I walked toward the door, I heard David's chair scrape back. Margaret's voice rose in panic. David, you can't possibly. Mom, stop, he said, and I heard real anger in his voice for the first time. You've gone too far, way too far. I didn't turn around as I left the dining room, but I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. Accusations, denials, the clatter of someone dropping silverware. The last thing I heard as I closed the front door was Margaret's wail. She can't take our home, not our home. But I could, and they knew it. The drive home that night was tense. David alternated between stunned silence and rapid-fire questions. How long have you known? Why didn't you tell me? What are you planning to do? I explained everything. How I'd discovered their financial troubles, formed the LLC under my maiden name, and worked with the bank to purchase their debt. I wasn't planning to use it, I admitted. It was just insurance, protection against your mother's cruelty. I never thought I'd actually need it. When we got home, David paced our living room for hours. His phone buzzed constantly with texts and calls from his family, which he ignored. Around midnight, he finally sat beside me. I've been blind, he said quietly. I kept making excuses for them, telling myself they just needed time to accept you. But tonight, he shook his head. No one deserves to be treated that way, especially not by family. The next morning, Christmas Day, our doorbell rang at 7 a.m. Richard stood on our porch, looking like he hadn't slept. David let him in reluctantly. I came to apologize, Richard said, his voice rough, and to ask what you want. Respect, I answered simply. That's all I've ever wanted. Richard nodded slowly. The family is in chaos. Margaret hasn't stopped crying. The girls are blaming me for the financial mess. It's not a Merry Christmas. I'm sorry about that, I said, and meant it, but I'm not sorry I finally stood up for myself. Over coffee, Richard revealed the full extent of their financial troubles. The family fortune had been dwindling for generations, masked by extravagant spending and social pretensions. His investments in a friend's hedge fund had been the final blow. Margaret doesn't know how bad it really is, he confessed. The mortgage is just the beginning. We have credit card debt, personal loans. We've been living on appearances for years. I saw a broken man beneath the aristocratic facade, someone who'd been crushed by the weight of family expectations just as I had been. I don't want your house, I told him. I want a fresh start, for all of us. In the days that followed, more truths emerged. David's sisters called separately, each admitting they'd enabled their mother's behavior out of fear. Elizabeth confessed she'd always envied my confidence and independence. Catherine revealed she was contemplating divorce from her socially appropriate husband, who had gambling debts of his own. A week after Christmas, we met with the entire family at a neutral location, a conference room at David's law firm. I brought my proposal. I would restructure their mortgage with fair terms, but with conditions. First, family counseling for everyone. Second, Margaret would volunteer weekly at a community center in a low-income neighborhood where I had once worked. Third, their home would host a fundraiser for the scholarship program that had helped me attend college. Margaret was initially resistant, but Richard and the others persuaded her. "We have no choice, Maggie," Richard said, "and frankly, we don't deserve one after how we've treated Melissa." The most unexpected twist came 2 months later during a family counseling session. As we worked through years of resentment and hurt, Margaret broke down completely. "I was terrified of you," she admitted through tears. "You reminded me of myself, who I was before I married into the Caldwell name. I grew up poor in South Boston. My accent, my clothes, my manners, I changed everything to fit in. When I saw you being accepted just as you were, I couldn't bear it. It felt like my whole life had been a lie." The revelation stunned everyone, especially her daughters who had never known their mother's background. The perfect Caldwell matriarch had been performing a role for decades, erasing her own origins while tormenting me for mine. That spring, the Caldwell home hosted its first scholarship fundraiser. Margaret, still learning to let go of appearances, worked alongside me in the kitchen rather than hiring caterers. "My mother's recipes," she said quietly, showing me handwritten cards with Irish stew and bread pudding. "I haven't made these in 30 years." By summer, David and I had made a decision of our own. We sold our house and bought a small farm outside the city, a place with no pretensions, where we could start our own traditions. Richard began coming over to help with repairs, finding satisfaction in working with his hands. Elizabeth's children loved feeding the chickens we'd started raising. The mortgage papers? I still have them, locked in our home safe. Not as a threat, but as a reminder of how far we've all come. The grand family estate is now just a house, still beautiful, but no longer a shrine to appearances. Margaret has started hosting simple Sunday dinners there, with mismatched plates and silverware that's meant to be used, not displayed. Last week, she called to ask if I would help her clear out the attic. "Too many ghosts up there," she said. "Too many things nobody needs." As we sorted through generations of Caldwell heirlooms, she handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a set of silver, not fancy or antique, just simple, sturdy utensils. "These were my mother's," she said. "The only things I brought with me when I married Richard. I want you to have them." It wasn't the heirloom sterling silver that had been on the Christmas table. It was something more valuable. A piece of her true self, finally brought into the light. Sometimes, the strongest foundations are built on the ruins of what once seemed unbreakable. That Christmas dinner with the plastic cutlery wasn't the end of my story with the Caldwells. It was the beginning of something authentic. I won't pretend it's been easy. Real healing rarely is. There are still awkward moments and old habits that die hard. But when I look at our family now, yes, I can finally call them that. I see people, not performances. I see the vulnerability behind the armor that Margaret wore for decades. I see Richard finding joy in simple accomplishments instead of fading social status. I see a family learning that the tables we gather around matter less than the conversations we have at them. As for David and me, we're expecting our first child this fall, a daughter. We've decided to name her after both our mothers, a bridge between worlds that once seemed impossibly far apart. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that sometimes you have to break the social contract to create a genuine connection. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is disrupt the comfortable patterns that keep everyone miserable. And sometimes the family you fight hardest with becomes the family you fight hardest for. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own life, remember, you have more power than you know. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give others is the truth they're afraid to face. Thanks for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more real-life experiences about finding strength in unexpected places. Until next time, remember, real silver tarnishes, But real relationships, built on honesty and respect, only grow stronger with time.